I want to introduce Kate Soper, the next keynote. She's been a leading member of the environmentalist and peace movements in Britain and Europe, a pioneering writer on Marxism and ecology, on alternative hedonism, on politics of nature, and a critic of post-structuralist feminism. She's had a long association with radical philosophy. She's been an editorial collective member and writer for the New Left Review, and a regular columnist for the US-based journal Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. She's translated several writers, Michel Foucault, Castoriadis, to name two. She is today an emeritus professor of philosophy and a former researcher with the Institute for the Study of European Transformations at London Metropolitan University. She has also held an honorary professorship at the University of Brighton. And Kate Soper has been a lead researcher in the research project on alternative hedonism and the theory of politics of consumption, funded by the British Economic and Social Research Council. That was in 2004 to 6. And she has been involved in a number of research projects on climate change and sustainable consumption, most recently as a visiting fellow at the Pufendorf Institute at Lund University in Sweden. And I should mention there are several publications. I mention Troubled Pleasures from 1990. What is Nature, Culture, Politics, and the Non-Human from 95. That's the one I was most interested in. And the latest one is called Post-Growth Living for an Alternative Hedonism. It was from 2020. So I'll say welcome, and thank you for coming here. We look forward to your...
Thank you very much for that introduction. If I speak like this, are you all hearing okay? Yeah? I mean, if I go too low or you need to hear better, just shout at me or something, or wave a hand. I want to thank the Danish Society of Philosophers for inviting me to speak to you today, and to thank you all for coming out. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I appreciate the whole cultural experience of being in Denmark, and particularly in Copenhagen, where I've been a few times before, so it's particularly nice to come back. I'm not talking directly today about the argument of the recent book. I'm trying to address the issue, the nature of nature, from the point of view of the talk I'm giving around the theme of animal life under capitalism. And because I feel that literature, and I always have felt this, has as much to teach us about philosophy as philosophy maybe has to teach literature, maybe even more in some ways. I like it the two-way exchange. So I'm going to begin with a poem. I'll put it up for you. I hope you can read it. It's by the Irish poet Derek Maughan, who recently died. It's called The Bronx Seabird and comes from his New York Times sequence. Insider trading reports are linked to price of bonds, no solution at hand, while nuclear waste piles up. New York toughing it out to get through cold. Question reality. Death is back. Night Owl, Gabriel 141. AT&T Boeing, Chrysler DuPont, Digital Dow Jones, Exxon General Motors, IBM 9X Sears, Paranoia, McCann Erickson America After Dark, escaped Bronx seabirds spotted in Central Park. On ledge and rail they sit, Inca-tern and Andean gull, who fled their storm-wrecked cage in the Bronx Zoo and now flap in exhilaration and growing fear above Yonkers, New Rochelle, Great Neck, Astoria, Long Beach, Red Hook, Bay Ridge, the whole tri-state area. A transmigration of souls, crazy-eyed as they peer through mutant cloud cover and air thick with snow dust, toxic aerosol dazzle and invasive car exhaust, or perch forlorn on gargoyle and asbestos roof, fine, feathered, ruffled, attentive, almost too high to hear the plaintive, desolate cab horns on Madison and Fifth. Like Daisy Cunard's nightingale, they belong in another life. They are intrigued, baffled, and finally bored stiff by the wised-up millions lunching far below. But vulnerable, too, as askance they stare at the alien corn of Radio City, Broadway, and Times Square, and up again at the clouds. Where on earth can they go? They won't touch garbage, so where and what will they eat? If you see one of these nervous birds on ledge or sill, dark blue, light grey, white head and tail, red bill, contact the Manhattan Avian Rehab Center, 212-689-3039, and ask for Claire or Jill. Though, to be frank, their chances are less than fair, nor, to be honest, is our confidence great that these rare species will be fit to compete in the fight for survival on the city street with urban gulls, crows, and other toughs of the air. The major contextual theme here is the dominance of corporate capitalism, whose trading reports are rolled out ceaselessly around the clock, exercising such determination on all animal life, human and otherwise, and impacting in so many ways on the material environment, the city architecture, nuclear waste, air pollution, car congestion, and so forth. But at the center of the poem, of course, is the fate of the seabirds, escaped from the zoo thanks to a storm we may link to climate change and its anthropogenic sources. And Mahon dwells on such links in a number of other poems, so I think we can presume that here too he intends a reference to the human hand in such supposedly natural disasters. But if the birds can be said to have escaped, it is to a very uncertain freedom, an emancipation that has only served to expose them to new dangers. For these are birds whose natural existence and lifestyle have been so jeopardized that they can be expected to survive, even if not to flourish, only in captivity. Once liberated from their zoo on earth, once liberated from their zoo, where on earth, as the poem says, can they otherwise go and hope to thrive? And what, given their specialist diet, their aversion to garbage, can they expect to eat? So we have here an interesting encapsulation in the poem of a dialectic whereby capitalism, having destroyed the natural conditions of existence for such so-called exotic seabirds, protects them in zoos and avian rehab centers, only at a later stage to generate the newly so-called natural forces of destruction. In other words, an at least in part humanly orchestrated storm that wrecks the zoo and sends the birds soaring in exhilaration above the New York skyline, yet only in the end to further entrap them in their newly alien environment. And in that environment, the poem concludes, when faced with the competition from, I quote, urban gulls, crows, and other toughs of the air, they are unlikely to survive. Rather than, as humans are caught up under capitalist, I know that's not a seabird, by the way, but it's the only one I could find sitting perched on a ledge in a sort of interesting way. So anyway, here we have an interesting encapsulation in the poem of a dialectic whereby capitalism, having destroyed the natural conditions of existence for such exotic seabirds, protects them in zoos and avian rehab centers, only at a later stage to generate the so-called newly natural forces of resuction. And rather as humans are caught up under capitalist relations of production in a battle for survival, in which there are inevitable winners and losers, and the greedier and more fortunately placed are likely to make out best, so the birds too find themselves competing in an alien context in which only the more aggressive and indiscriminate are likely to survive. I'm not suggesting here that there are direct parallels with human society and its inequalities of wealth and class, but only that in a very general way, the conditions of existence of both humans and animals, in this particular case birds, are extensively moulded by capitalism and would be very different without that formation. Nor, incidentally, should I be taken to imply by this that animals are necessarily that much worse off under capitalism than they were under earlier modes of production. Some indeed will argue that in certain respects some animals fare better now and are spared a great deal of the suffering they had to endure in earlier periods. For example, no daily horsewhipping, bull baiting, cockfighting, use of swans for cleaning the chimney, and so on. But of course, largely as a consequence of capitalism, huge numbers of animal species are now threatened with loss of habitat and ultimate extinction. And many of the individuals of these species are therefore suffering in ways that have little parallel in earlier epochs. It's difficult, therefore, to make generalized comparisons or to draw up any kind of balance sheet here, and I don't intend to do it, but only to point out that different societies, cultures, and economies impinge in very differing ways on animals. Capitalism has subjected animals to new forms of misery, even as it's rescued them from others. It's provided avian rehab centers, but it's also created the exterminating conditions that render those centers essential to bird survival. Let me note, lastly, de Marron's poem is also the site of some interestingly ironic reflections on human-animal relations. And since I'm addressing an audience of Danish philosophers, I might add that these reflections have some affinity with Kierkegaard's view of animals as helpful in awakening humans to better understanding of themselves. At one point, I think he speaks of the bird, or as he calls it, winged traveller, I don't know what the Danish is, I'm afraid, as being an unrivaled professor in the art of living. At any rate, the bird's eye view of the streets below, with their car congestion and polluted atmosphere, elicits, as Marx says, a growing fear. The birds themselves perch forlornly on gargoyles and asbestos roofs. The poem, in other words, gestures to a romantic critique of this urban reality, and there's a clear reference to the lines of Keats' Ode on the Nightingale, about Ruth in her exile, perhaps hearing the nightingale's song as she stood, as Keats puts it, amid the alien corn, hence the title of this talk. The birds then belong in another life, but from the optic of that life, New York human life is boring. Underdeveloped, dominated by the sound and fumes of combustion engine, and the privileged wised-up diners are munching away in their restaurants down below, oblivious to what they are missing, to the tedium of their own polluting and destructive mode of existence. Here then, the optic of the non-human species serves to expose the confined and paltry pleasures of human existence, and thus to signal, dare I claim it, the alternative hedonism that might be enjoyed by both human and non-human animals in a post-capitalist, post-consumerist order of being. So the poem concludes with a utopian gesture, on which I'll have a little more to say later. But for now, I want to expand and clarify the comment about capitalism-animal interactions by relating it to a broader and more general frame of reference. For capitalism is, after all, only one of many economic modes, all of which, as I've suggested, have had their particular and otherwise and often exploitative or otherwise negative impact on animal life, whether wild or domestic. For the condition of animals has been shaped by very material influences of a relatively permanent or transhistoric character, most notably human dependencies on them for food, transport, and leisure activities. It's also been marked by a central and perennial contradiction between abuse and love, between what we might term the instrumental, exploitative, and the personal, affective, spiritual relations that humans have to animals, who are, to put it in a nutshell, both eaten and cosseted, derided and worshipped, driven to extinction, and heavily protected. And reflecting, no doubt, a sensitivity to this contradiction, we've seen shifting human attitudes towards the use and well-being of animals, influences which are themselves reflected in a history of human-animal etiquette, governance, and legal regulation. We need to bear this in mind, both in the selection of what we deem typically capitalist practice and experience, and from a methodological point of view. To focus on the topic of capitalism and animals is to focus on the specifically capitalist form of these general human-animal dependencies, emotional responses, and regulatory practices. To quote Marx's advice here on the general category of production in his 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse, where he writes, "All epochs of production have certain common traits, common characteristics. Production in general is an abstraction, but a rational one insofar as it really brings out and fixes a common element, and thus saves us repetition. Some determinations of production belong to all epochs, others only to a few. Some will be shared by the most modern epoch and the most ancient. No production will be thinkable without them. Nevertheless, just those things which determine their development, in other words, the elements which are not general and common, must be separated out from the determinations valid for production as such," which we might rework as some human relations and attitudes to animals will belong to all epochs, others only to a few, some will be shared by the most modern and the most ancient. No human world of production will be thinkable without animals, and so on. Yet impeccable as this advice may sound, it's not always easy to observe in the lesser. In the case of non-human animals, we may certainly offer accounts of their particular conditions of existence today in a wide variety of contexts coexisting within globalized capitalism. Animal studies have now provided many excellent instances. We are aware, moreover, of a particular dialectic of forces and influences coming together in the formation of the capitalist era. We know that the liberal Enlightenment thinking that accompanied the rise of capitalism and reflected, at least in part, the contractual relations that replaced earlier slave or feudal forms of ownership and exploitation of human labor power, also had an impact on attitudes to animals and led to their more considerate treatment in some cases. But we also know what a key role has been played in animal experience by the pressures of capitalist competition. For example, as the driver of agribusiness or of the use of animal products in the making and testing, indeed, of a wide variety of commodities. We know, too, that the contradiction between the instrumental reification of animals as providers of articles for human consumption or entertainment and their treatment as personalized pets and companions has been made even more acute under capitalism, while also taking specific and sometimes quite grotesque forms due to the intense commodification of both aspects of the relationship. Factory farming and animal testing is but one example of the intensification of the instrumental side. The market for everything from luxury pet goods and dog restaurants to animal spa treatments, designer bridal veils, and diamond-studded collars is an instance of one of the personal affective. Is another image. Indeed, some of the more bizarre examples of the commodification of the affective pole suggest a flip over into the more instrumental attitude. So the pooch is used simply as a means of displaying the excessive wealth of its owner, in ways very comparable to those in which female adornment has been used for the display of aristocratic or tycoon status. Or the dog has become an advertising model or influencer on the so-called catwalk. On the other hand, we might also include as instances of the effective response in our culture today the current surge in sympathetic academic studies, or at any rate the much greater concern today not only for the physical maltreatment of non-human species, but also for their ontological and ethical status. And obviously this gathering here is an example of that. So we can list some of the general impacts of capitalism on animals, but it would be a much more demanding task of scholarship to analyze the exact effects of specifically capitalist forms of relations to their experience. According to Keith Thomas, writing in the mid-1980s, a mixture of compromise and concealment has so far prevented the central contradiction between exploitative and effective relations to animals from having to be resolved. But he argues, I quote him, "The issue cannot be evaded, and it can be relied upon to recur. It is one of the contradictions upon which modern civilization can be said to rest. About its ultimate consequences, we can only speculate." To this, we might add that the critics of capitalism, until quite recently, have been no more willing to address the conflict from capitalism to address the conflict than the defendants of capitalism. In the case of classical Marxism, the focus was always on the exploitation of the human rather than the non-human workforce, with little, if any, attention paid to the plight of animals in industry, farming, transport, and entertainment. A few images here of this. Even when Marxist studies were taken up in the academy from the 1970s onwards, the topic received little, if any, mention. In Sartre's oh, what have I done here? Sorry, yeah. Here's some images of them used in transport. In Sartre's existentialist Marxism, notably his critique of dialectics, animals scarcely seem to exist. This silence went together with a strong resistance to naturalism, and there was, in fact, something of a phobia during this whole resurgent period towards biology and any attempt to anchor social theory by reference to qualities or experiences we shared with other creatures. Things began to change only with the emergence of the Green Movement in the 1980s and the recognition of anti-capitalist intellectuals of the need to offer some kind of reconstructed red-green eco-socialism. Many, though not all of these critical responses have been anti-humanist in the sense of denouncing the anthropocentricity or human speciesism of those emphasizing human-animal differences. Instead, they've argued for an anti-dualist or naturalist ontology that recognizes the extent of human-animal affinities and grounds the radical politics in what we share with other creatures, rather than in human exceptionality. One of the earliest, and possibly still the most sophisticated instances of this recourse to naturalism in left-wing animal studies is to be found in Ted Benton's Natural Relations, Ecology, Animal Rights and Social Justice. Benton there charges Marx with being mistakenly speciesist or humanist when he described alienation as reducing humans to the level of animal existence. Marx's exact claim, to be found in his 1844 Paris manuscripts, was that alienation makes the worker, I quote, feel that he is acting freely only in his animal functions, eating, drinking, and procreating, while in his human functions he feels only like an animal. The animalistic becomes the human, and the human the animalistic. Benton objects to the claim because it relies on the dualist idea that it is animal nature to do no more than merely exist, and thus fails to recognize the actual complexity and diversity of animal powers and capacities, and their likenesses to those of humans. In expanding on this theme, animals are presented by Benton as afflicted by the so-called pathology of alienation, no less than humans, and thus denied the realization of their proper species being. Production regimes, he argues, of the kind used in factory farming impose massive constraints and distortions on the mode of life of species of non-human animals caught up in them. Their lives are sustained solely to serve purposes extrinsic to them. Conditions and means for the acquisition and exercise of their species' powers are denied to them, and more specifically, their social needs and capacities are systematically suppressed. In short, a good deal of the content of Marx's contrast between fulfilled or emancipated human life and a dehumanized, estranged existence can also be applied in an analysis of the conditions imposed by intensive rearing regimes in the case of non-human animals. This is persuasive in some respects, but by invoking the idea of animal alienation, Benton would seem to cast out one kind of dualism, only to introduce another, through reliance on the contrast between a pathological, does that mean unnatural, and a non-alienated, does this mean natural, animality. It looks, in other words, as if animals can live their lives either in a properly animal or a sub-animal kind of way, which may be so. But it opens up a question, or rather a host of questions about what counts as a properly realized life for any individual of any animal species. Whether that remains unchanged across different cultures and time, how it can be known, and who, other than humans who have undertook to represent them, is in a position to pronounce on this. Moreover, and relatedly, alienation on any Marxist understanding of it is clearly a condition to which a species is liable only if its members are also, at least in principle, able to become conscious of it and to do something about removing it. One might, in Orwellian vein, imagine some kind of Spartacist uprising among the cattle, pigs, or battery hens, but it seems unlikely ever to happen. Nor, I might add, can animals be alienated by their own productions, their webs, nests, hives, and so on. That said, there can be no question of the originality and eloquence of Benton's critique of capitalist exploitation of animals, and it surely remains a seminal text on the topic. Here, he and other writers on animal liberation during this period, Peter Singer, Tom Regan, and others, were writing well ahead of the continental philosophers. For example, in his text of 1997, L'animal que dont je suis, translated into English as the animal that therefore I am, more to follow. Jacques Derrida, for example, denounces the violence of human treatment of animals and rails against the falsely assimilating category of the animal, but nowhere acknowledges the ways in which his arguments had figured several years earlier in the debates of Anglo-American environmental ethics. Nor can there be any question of the subsequent prevalence of non-dualist approaches to human-animal relations, following on this text of this approach of Benson's, where the dominant, now called post-humanist paradigm, although admittedly a very broad church, is resistant to treating the differences between humans and other animals as anything but matters of degree within an essential ontological continuity. In the work of these thinkers, we've seen the emergence of an eco-inflected stance which has invited us to blur or collapse earlier conceptual divisions between humans and animals, and to welcome this as both humanly emancipatory and ecologically progressive. In other words, as an anti-anthropocentric advance that recognizes the parity, connectivity, and relationality of all forms of being. In this respect, the post-humanists appear to share in the assumption that runs through Benton's argument that the more we come to recognize the fluidity of the divide between the human and the animal, the more eco-friendly our politics are likely to be. Or at any rate, the less tolerant we shall become of the maltreatment of animals. I should make clear here that in defending what is sometimes termed human exceptionalism, against that set of claims, I'm not defending a Cartesian conception of the human subject as exhaustively self-knowing and self-directing. I accept the wisdom of a good deal of what follows from the Nietzschean, Marxian, Freudian, and more recently Foucaultian, Derridian, Deleuzian post-structuralist critique of the humanist subject, conceived as an epistemologically self-transparent, all-knowing, all-seeing agent of history. Human persons, like other animals, are subject to trans-individual systemic processes and pressures, including language and other semiotic systems that are presupposed to their forms of consciousness and communication rather than purely expressive tools. But the post-humanist insistence on grounding a more animal-friendly politics in affinities with the non-human is surely contestable. I would argue, on the contrary, that both dualist and anti-dualist may be equally sensitive to the cruelties suffered by animals and bring very similar intuitions to bear in their judgments about the ways animals should be treated. What matters here, it seems, is not so much the theories we hold, but what we feel, the strength of our compassion or intuitive resistance to certain ways of treating animals. So I would endorse a good part of the argument of those, and they include, for example, Carrie Wolf, Cora Diamond, Derrida himself, who want to problematize the discourse of rights in its application to animals on the grounds that it rests on an inadequate conception of justice, one that fails to see that what generates our moral response to animals and their treatment is not some distanced and impartial calculation of what rightful consideration is due to them, but rather our sense of the mortality and vulnerability we share with them and the compassion that goes with that. The mistake, as Cora Diamond has put it, is, I quote her, to think that the callousness to animals cannot be condemned without reasons which are reasons for anyone, no matter how devoid of all human imagination or sympathy. Elizabeth Costello, the vegetarian novelist in James Kurtz's novel The Lives of Animals, makes a similar point when she suggests that true empathy with animals would not be exercised by seeing how far they approximate to mentally deficient human beings. In other words, she implies there is something ethically ill-judged in applying the yardstick of reason at all. But it is precisely with a view to sustaining the philosophical coherence of this kind of position, with its appeal to the distinctive role of human imagination and sympathy in generating moral response, that we need, I submit, to defend human exceptionality. Diamond herself accepts this, I think, when she argues that the concept of the human being is the main source of that moral sensibility, which we may then be able to extend to non-human animals. In explanation, she writes, if we appeal to people to prevent suffering, and we in our appeal try to obliterate the distinction between human beings and animals and just get people to speak of different species of animals, there's no footing left from which to tell us what we ought to do, because it is not members of one among species of animals that have moral obligations to anything. The moral expectations of other human beings demand something of me as other than an animal. And we do something like imaginatively read into animals something like such expectations when we think of vegetarianism as enabling us to meet a cow's eyes. There's nothing wrong with that. There is something wrong with trying to keep that response and destroy its foundation. And in line with this, I think we need to also acknowledge that in the absence of the concept of the human, there can be no argument even to the effect that animals should be treated on a par with us as subjects, and so forth. We also know that no animals can think of themselves as having responsibility towards us in the way that many humans do towards them. I'm not denying here that some companion animals, dogs in particular, will exercise at times quite striking forms of care and concern for their particular owners or handlers. What I mean is that no other animal species, as a species, they don't conceive nor exercise any universally applicable form of concern for the members of other animal species, humans included. My claim here, I think, is quite similar to Heidegger's view of animals as what he calls poor in world. In other words, as unable to relate to other beings as such. Animals are open to other beings, but unlike humans, they're not able to encounter other beings in a context that allows that being to be comprehended. The sensibility that makes us, or should make us, hesitate about assimilating other animal species too closely to human beings must surely also allow us to recognize the extent of failure of reciprocity at this level between ourselves and other creatures. Not only can no other animal recognize a right or feel an obligation to respect it, most other animals are also indifferent to the welfare of other species beings. Unfortunately so, since many would die of starvation were they to exercise any human-style moral compunction about the suffering of the creatures they daily catch, tear apart, and eat alive. Nor, finally, it seems, can any non-human animal begin to imagine what it's like to be a human being, let alone write about it. Allow me here, then, to invoke another Irish poet. In its narrative of saintly self-abnegation to animal interest, Seamus Heaney's poem, St. Kevin and the Blackbird, it's not quoted in full here, but only the most relevant verses, offers a poignant reflection on some of these extreme asymmetries of sensibility. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out of the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and flown. Here's a not very exciting image of St. Kevin. So human exceptionality is here manifest not in some arrogant indifference to animal well-being, but in self-abnegation to the animal's ends. Whether it be prayer, compassion, imagination, or the writing of poetry, they all in differing ways speak to the nature of the abyss between ourselves and all other animals, however divergent those animals are in their particular species characteristics and capacities. And here too, there's, I think, a comparable argument in Kierkegaard's view, that the selection of the higher orders of religious experience, together with its risks and exacting demands, is what truly differentiates humans from non-humans. This human-animal divide should be respected both culturally and politically, even as we continue to ponder its implications and what we should do about it. Sorry, that's a bird killer rather than a bird who is taking advantage there. But I think some post-humanists do seem to come very close to denying that there are any significant differences at all between humans and other animals. How am I doing for time? Am I okay? 5 minutes more. Okay. Tim Morton, for example, in his book The Ecological Thought, writes, do non-humans possess language? Yes. How about imagination? Check. Reason? Yeah. Can non-humans feel compassion? Of course. Do they have a sense of humour? Why not? Humans are fairly uniquely good at throwing and sweating. Not much of a portfolio. The ecological thought, then, should not set up consciousness as yet another defining trait of superiority over non-humans. Moreover, even when differences between humans and other creatures are acknowledged, the problem remains whenever these are treated as all on a par. Donna Haraway, for example, accepts that there are differences between all species of animals, humans included, but she seems to want us to accept that there is no reason to privilege any species over any other. On the contrary, she speaks in her book, When Species Meet, of the fantasy of human exceptionalism and describes it as an outrage. But I think if we take these arguments at face value, we can't at the same time grant them ethical status. For example, if we seriously question whether we should continue to privilege human intellectual and emotional capacities in our dealings with other forms of being, then this new post-humanist schema will also subvert the range of normative distinctions associated with the earlier moment of human exceptionalism, and thus undermine the power of those distinctions to support, which they can't appeal to them in support of collapsing earlier ontological distinctions between humans and animals, or in Haraway's cyborg thinking between the human and the machinic. In other words, if we were indeed to give up any privileging of distinctive human characteristics, including presumably the idea of the human person as enjoying some special claim to self-realization, then why should we any longer find the idea of the clone morally problematic, or think of cloning as distraining on human species being? Even those who would have us blur the mind-machine conceptual division have argued for it on the basis of the quasi-mind possession and ensouled qualities of advanced computerization. But if those capacities or attributes are themselves regarded as problematic, because rooted in some regrettably humanist endorsement of human powers of cognition and reflexivity, in some preferring of minds and souls, then why should the approximations of artificial intelligence to human capacities be accorded any special attention in this context? The irony I'm suggesting of the post-humanist invitation to deny any privileging of capacities distinctive to humanity is that if we were wholly able to do so, we would no longer recognize the force of the moral issues we're being called upon to address in dealing with cruelty to animals. And let me add, and this is really my last point here, let me just add finally that by way of linking back to my earlier points on ecological politics, that as part of my humanist position, I've always wanted to emphasize the quite unique ecological destructiveness of human beings, especially the more affluent communities among them. Much in contrast to the essentially cyclical and reproductive mode of other animals, humans are squandering the planet's resources through the commitment to the growth economy and its model of prosperity, a model rooted in ever-expanding material consumption, new needs, as we call them, much of it driven now by highly aggressive brand marketing, fast fashion, and the continuous invention of needs whose products are junked within weeks or never used. So I'm saying what needs emphasizing here, and these essentially my last points, I'll stop here because we need to have time for questioning, is not so much our kinship with other species, although I'm not disputing that that is quite extensive, but our currently dominant and species-specific model of the good life, with its rapacious consumption and endless creation of waste. Relative to other animals, we are, I would argue, underdetermined in respect of the forms of our satisfaction, pleasure, and fulfillment, able in principle to break with unsustainable modes of gratification, and uniquely placed to engage in revised thinking on the politics of prosperity and the essentials of the good life. If we dwell instead only on what we do share with other animate life and on our interconnectedness with the rest of nature, then I think we invite a kind of positivism and fatalism of approach. It can give comfort, in other words, to the view that humans are no more accountable for their environmental vandalism than the Dutch elm beetle for its destruction of the elm, and no better placed than they to correct the impact. By extension, we humans must, on that argument, also be seen as fated to particular forms of instrumental use and maltreatment of other species. So what matters, I think, eco-politically, is recognition both of the human role in bringing about ecological collapse and of the distinctive capacities that humans have to monitor and, in principle, adjust their behaviour and environmental impact. I'll stop there, okay, so we can have time for questioning.
Thank you very much. And questions? Raise your hands.
Well, thank you very much. I I particularly am thrilled with your critique of the postmodernism conception of all matters matter, or all mattering matters. I think that's Bennett's words for it. But I wonder, can you maybe elaborate a little bit on the... I think we can use the flat ontologies, as you say, to a way of knowing more of the equalness or sameness that we share with other species or non-human. But our tendency to always hierarchize, I mean, I don't think we can ever overcome that, also for the reason that some other species are very dangerous to us, like bacteria. And so this idea that all matters matter and everything is equal, I don't think that's ever like a good thing only. So maybe you could elaborate on how we could overcome the paradox of saying we actually are much more the same as at least the old ideas assume, but yet, you know, how can we then appreciate and take better care of other species?
Thank you. Well, actually, I think your question itself, with the recognition of the paradox in it, as it were, is part of the answer in a way. I mean, I think it is novel now that we have discussions of this kind relative to earlier eras, and are thinking about our relations to animals, as I've tried to indicate in the piece in a way, has taken on this new dimension in which we are very aware of the tension, if you like, very aware that we cannot escape a certain anthropocentric way of thinking about our relations, not just to animals, but to the inanimate world as well, that we come back to ourselves, both in terms of our own needs in some sense, yes, and also I think in terms of the qualities which we sense are, in a way, we're privileged to be able to enjoy, and which actually alone makes sense of the concerns we do have for the rest of nature, if you like, conceiving of ourselves in this sense as part of everything, of the natural world in general. So I suppose the answer, sometimes I think you don't overcome paradoxes, but being aware of paradoxes and being able to think, wanting to think them through, recognizing problems, is part of the advance in politics, I think, and in ethics. So knowing that you've got these tensions is part of what I think means that the paradigm of thinking has shifted somehow, and brought us into new ways of trying to engage with the world and the problems, in this case, of animals in relation to ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much. That was an extremely interesting and stimulating presentation. I would like to ask you about something that you touched on very briefly during the section on Marx concerning the concept of alienation. So I found your critique of the sort of Marxian maybe tendency to define the concept of alienation as a reduction to animality convincing. But I would like to ask, in light of what you end up saying about the it being necessary to keep some of the fundamental differences between humans and the other animals in respect to being able to recognize what normative demands there still exist between us and other species. Can we use concepts of alienation to grasp some of the specific normative questions that are raised with regard to the condition that animals live under capitalism? I'm thinking specifically of what was evoked by the poem you started out with, that it seems like there's something akin to or analogous to alienation for the animals in this condition where humans have transformed so much of the environment into human-specific modes of production and consumption.
Yeah, great. It's a very good comment. I think, in fact, I mean, there is a I think that Mohan talks of their alien existence in a way, doesn't he? And I mean, I think part of the answer, I suppose, when I was talking about Benton and the problem of the new dualism introduced by allowing animals to have an alienated experience in ways comparable to ours, I was focusing very much on a specifically Marxist way of thinking about alienation, where it is only introduced through the sale of human labour in a way, and at least that's his primary concern in the passage in the manuscripts that I was quoting. And in that sense, it is very much a condition that comes about through the move from feudalism to capitalism, and instead of money or wealth being acquired politically through gift of the king or whatever, it comes about through the exploitation, through the buying and selling of labour. And then it seems to be a condition that can only be applied in a way to group of beings, in other words, humans, who are in a position to come to acknowledge their condition and to do something about it. But, of course, the concept of alienation, it seems to me, has a much broader resonance now. And I think increasingly, I mean, it's been used in the most general sort of way within environmental discourse to think about our own alienation from nature, you know, for example. And that, I don't think, it doesn't really correspond very directly to that early use in Marx's manuscript. So I think, yes, I mean, I think I probably agree with you that we have created conditions that are, if you like, alien. I suggested alien to ourselves. I think the poem does as well, because, you know, the animals are looking down and in some sort of, I don't know, it implied a sort of negative reflection on what's going on below in the street. So we're living in these sort of alien conditions down there, and we've also, yes, created a certain kind of alienating global context, in many cases for other animals. I mean, you want to use the term in a way to talk about what goes on in a lot of agribusiness, for example, I would say as well, you know. So in the much more looser and romantic, a more generalized romantic kind of notion of alienation from nature, yes, I think I would agree with you. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, your third point, which I find very interesting, which we're looking at now. Relative to other animals, we're malleable in respect to the forms of our satisfaction, pleasure, and fulfillment, able in principle to break with unsustainable modes of gratification. I wonder if that would be the point of contention between yourself and, let's say, Tim Morton, or maybe a more malevolent Tim Morton. In the sense that somebody like Tim Morton might say, well, able in, contesting this radical distinction between humans and animals precisely, when you say able in principle to break with unsustainable modes of gratification. And let's say this malevolent Tim Morton would say, really? In principle, yeah, in principle, we could do anything. But in principle, in fact, though, we haven't broken with our unsustainable modes of gratification. And if Tim really wanted to be cynical, he could say there's nothing on the horizon that indicates that we're really going to break with those unsustainable modes of gratification. In which case, you're back in the other way of looking at things, which is that really we're not that different from animals. So it seems to me a lot of your argument hinges on that able in principle to break with unsustainable modes of gratification. So that in principle then is the crucial word. In principle, but should we believe in that in principle?
I mean, I guess it really, ultimately, what I think you're raising here is the issue of why we are engaging in these kinds of debates at all. If we do actually really think of ourselves as fated in a way to carry on without any sort of capacity to monitor, control, and transform what we're doing in any directly conscious sense, then in a way it sort of undermines the way in which quite a lot of those arguing from that more extreme kind of post-humanist position that Morton has. It's unclear what it is, what they feel to be the purpose or ultimate direction of what they're claiming. And in fact, on the whole, Morton himself can be just as inconsistent, I think, in what he thinks that we're going to do. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, we're just kind of apparently pushed by these, you know, we're fated in a way, or there's nothing we can do about anything. We should welcome every single sort of emergence as it emerges. On the other hand, he also has all these sort of ways of being terribly optimistic about how we're going to, you know. I mean, there's a lot of normativity in if you attend closely to what he's saying. I think there's at least as much normativity as there would be in mine. I admit, I said, in principle, that's true. I would also add, though, that there is some evidence that we are rethinking our consumption. I don't think we'd be talking about this here, for example, if we weren't. And in my argument around, in the book, actually, which I haven't really directly addressed today, but in the Post-Growth Living book around for an alternative hedonism, I mean, I do suggest that there has been a quite considerable radical revision of thinking about consumption and the work-life balance going on now. And I think that's more accepted as something that's essential to the warding off of the worst consequences of global warming, regardless of any other consequences it may have. And I think there's growing disquiet over the negative legacy of our time-scarce and work-dominated society. There is, I mean, people are rethinking consumption in the light of both the environmental degradation, but also in terms of their own interests in other ways of living. So I think the evidence is that we do have limited powers to control and change our ways of thinking about prosperity and gratification, and that quite a number of people are beginning to do that. Where that ultimately goes, only the future is going to, you know. But I really, what I want to say is, I don't think it's fated. Okay, maybe Morton would agree. We can kind of leave it at that, you know, because maybe he doesn't think it's fated either. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure he would disagree with that.
Yeah.
If you assume the malevolent one, cynical one,
Yeah.
say no.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe capitalism is a too narrow perspective, because already in the end of the Pleistocene we had killed most of the megafauna, and in the Holocene we have just continued killing the animals and suppressing them in all forms of ways long before capitalism. And so maybe the model of explanation is bigger than just capitalism.
Yeah, no, I thought I was trying to sort of deal in a way with that issue at the beginning of my talk by suggesting that there are these very general and transhistoric forms of maltreatment of animals, as well as transhistoric ways of looking after them, which are shared, I think. But then there's specific differences to each, to many different. There are different stages of history will have determinations of a particular kind in their treatment of animals. So yes, in the very earliest period, there would be particular forms of impact we humans would have had on animals, which are different from those of later modes of production, which are different from those of slavery or feudalism or of capitalism. So I thought, I mean, in a way, I completely agree with you. I mean, there is we've always relied on animals for our food, for our leisure, for our recreation, for our transport very often. And that's involved various forms of cruelty, which take different forms at different periods, I think. So I'm not disputing that. I mean, I wanted to focus on the here and now in a way, partly because of its implications for what we do next, as we've been talking about.
Thank you. I thought that was a terrific talk, but I want to piggyback on the question from over there about that third point, because I was also getting stuck on that last point, but from a really different angle. Because for me, what's a bit contentious about this third point is the idea that human malleability is what distinguishes us from animals, although I think maybe in some sense you've already qualified that enough that we understand that malleability to be the result of consciousness and agency rather than malleability per se. But bear with me for a minute, because I think that for me I would say animals, as in including the bird in your opening example, are actually, at least as at a species level, fairly exemplary in their ability to adapt. And that would be, I mean, obviously we could think about Darwin or all kinds of examples where animals feature as the ultimate sort of model of adaptability. And in that line of argument, it would be our responsibility to actually learn adaptability from animals in relation to our increasingly, let's say, shrinking environments. For instance, let's say we were told that we could no longer fly. As a species, we might just have to recalibrate and stop flying. Or to give an example of some, I'm thinking here specifically of Denmark as well, because for me, Denmark is always such an interesting place to live in relation to these questions of adaptability at a policy level. Like at KU recently, our canteen decided we were only going to have vegan food. And, you know, people moan a bit about it, but we're also all just eating vegan lunches, which is pretty great and pretty unthinkable from an American or even an English campus, right? But what it doesn't suggest is the kind of consumer agency that is so interesting about, that you're so invested in the final note of the argument. Because I don't think anybody feels that they're the agent of that decision. I think what we feel is our adaptability as a group able to respond to changing environmental conditions, much like the goldfish or the bird in the city or the raccoon who learns to live on pizza crusts or the... I mean, and in a way... I kind of want to at least stick with it enough to think about the idea that these big changes might not be agentive in the way that your argument suggests. They might also be responses to larger forms of state intervention or policy making, such as we see in Denmark.
Well, yes. I mean, I think, in a way, I suppose it's what we're talking in some way, I suppose, about what exactly we mean by malleability relative to adaptive behaviour, I suppose. I mean, you're quite right that other creatures, non-human creatures, do actually do a great deal of adapting, and that's almost been their history. It's true. I think what I am arguing here is that the malleability I'm talking about does get fed through in more conscious ways and thought about ways than applies in the case of other creatures, and that it's not dependent on the biological transmission in the way that it is in the case of other creatures, because we have an external matrix of knowledge, if you like. I mean, our knowledge, you know, is housed in the resources of libraries and now media and IT, and it's outside there. We're not dependent on the biological transmission of possibilities for adaptive behavior in the same way. I also think that we have politics, as it were. I mean, and other creatures do not. And in relation to the argument, I mean, I know where you're coming from. I mean, it's a very interesting point. But I think that I would want to say that in the case of we're now only having vegan food, that there has been pressure, whether people themselves realize it or not. They have been involved in the rethinking, as it were, as well. So yes, I mean, as part of my argument around alternative hedonism, I've never denied that it's not just the consumers who do all the changing of thinking, that you'll need, as it were, the implementation forms of policy as well. But there's a dialectic here. I mean, policies can only be brought in if there is a sufficient sort of acknowledgement of the need for them. How does that acknowledgement of the need for them come about? Partly, I'm suggesting, through the kind of pressures that individuals, in so far as they are political animals, are going to experience. I don't know if that makes kind of sense, but I think the answer is dialectic somehow between those two aspects. Do you see what I mean? Okay.
Isn't there a problem in the way we discuss the relation between humans and animals, in that by talking about all other kinds of animals as if they were just animals, ignores the enormous distinctions or the enormous differences between different types of animals and our very different relations and different normative responsibilities to different types of animals. I mean, one thing is cats and dogs that we are mainly talking about here, but what about rats, and what about
rats, fleas, viruses,
and all
insects,
kinds of other things? Isn't there a form of speciesism in that we regard all the rest as just animals and then see ourselves as different from them, ignoring the differences that there are between them?
Yes, I mean that's in fact that was the sort of point that Derrida was kind of wanting to emphasize in the essay I mentioned on l'animal que donc je suis, where he wants to introduce another word. He wants to introduce the word animaux. So that this kind of is a word that critiques our supposedly too assimilative use of the word animal. I mean, yes, of course. I mean, there are different. I mean, there are so many implications of the recognition of the diversity of animals. I mean, are we talking, as you say, about insects? Are we talking about tigers? Are we talking about, domestic pets and so on? In some ways, it's better perhaps just to talk about non-human, human and non-human animals in a way, rather than. However, I mean, are you challenging some of the points I'm making of the more philosophical kind from that? Because I don't think, for my purposes, I mean, I think it was okay, as it were, not to recognise more than I do that very extensive set of divergences between different creatures. But in other contexts, I think it's very important to recognise it. And if we are going to introduce new conditions and better conditions, if we do actually exert ourselves in some way to introduce a post-consumerist, a more regulated economy at least, if not a post-capitalist economy, then animals could well be treated in better ways. But we also need to think about the implications of the introduction of new forms of policy around them. If we abolish agribusiness, maybe we insist that if there is any provision for meat eating, then it's done in a so-called more humane way. What about if we say we've got, because of the similarities in our experience with other animals, we ought to actually allow them much more medical treatment than we do. Then there are lots of implications here. I mean, what about the resources? I mean, that would need a massive expansion of resources, which is not going to be terribly helpful from the point of view of environmental conservation. But also, when we say we might improve the medical provision for other animals, are we talking about, as you say, are we talking about rats? Are we talking about not only large animals? Are we talking about the most sentient animals? I mean, you're right to raise the issue. And it's worth thinking about as we move perhaps to a world in which we have a better sense of our forms of coexistence and our similarities as well as our differences. But there's huge numbers of questions still to be addressed, I think, of a moral kind then, which are partly to do with this question of diversity, I'd say.
Yes, thank you. I wonder what you would think about the tradition that draws on Aristotelian and Hegelian thought. That's been thinkers like John McDowell, Andrea Kern, Sebastian Rödel, who have introduced the metaphor of form to. I was thinking of it in the exchange you had before about changing to veganism. So their point is that of course we share a lot with a lot of animals, and more with some than with others.
Yeah.
But in our case, the form, our form of life, is such that even as we may abstract from that form, and we think in a way we reacted like a swarm of rats or bees, and in this case of adjusting our food habits. There's always the difference that we at any point could, and also if we look closer probably had, taken up into reflective consciousness various aspects of that process. Maybe not in a kind of clear, rigorous, deliberative way, but in a more or less unclear, probing way, thinking about what course to take, what courses, how to more or less adjust our actions, and that so that metaphor is supposed to enable us to, at the one hand, make a lot of comparisons with other species, but on the other hand, acknowledge that we, and perhaps, I mean, that's an open question, perhaps we may discover that other very developed animals also share that form, but we're not, we are able to take up into any aspect up into reflective consciousness and modulate it. So yeah, I just wonder what you think about that option.
Well, I think I don't know that work very well that you mentioned actually, but it seems to be fairly consistent with what I'm arguing. No, do you feel that it's not? Especially the parts where you were mentioning diamond. I mean, McDowell, Kern, and Rödel draw on diamond too. So that's one, because I was in doubt about exactly where you were ending up, but I thought you were ending up exactly in this idea of
basically it's a reformulation of the Aristotelian distinction between genus and species. I mean, of course we're animals. We share the genus.
Yeah. I'm not denying that. No, I mean.
No. I'm agreeing with you. Sorry.
Okay. But thanks for. I mean, that's a nice addition and expansion of some of the argument.
Thank you very much. So my question is rather broad. Maybe it's even sort of a meta question, because at some point you brought up, while talking about Ted Benton, and his work was like all the good stuff was in the 90s, and you draw upon an article from '93. You, in the same vein, mentioned people like Tom Regan, Peter Singer. You could have mentioned Bernard E. Rollin, other people. So it's clear to me that somehow, and I think you also touched upon that somehow that 90s, and I would say also the 80s and the 70s, animal philosophy was almost entirely the domain of people who did not think of themselves as in the continental tradition. Right. So there seemed to be at least 3 decades of modern animal philosophy that was in like one side of the philosophical tradition as we know it in a broader sense. And then since perhaps the noughts and onwards, we've seen phenomenologists and other becoming interested in animal lives. Could you say something about why? I've always wondered about it, and just because you touched upon it and kind of did a historical view of it, and what has that brought onto the scene that we can now have both phenomenologists and analytical political philosophers? Yes.
I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure how that has come about. I mean, I suppose I was quite struck by the way in which, for once, you know, having been, as it were, caught up in the continental tradition myself for quite a while, although I was trained initially as an analytic philosopher. In other words, a sort of Anglo-American, you know, background. I was quite struck by the avant-garde nature of Anglo-American thinking in the period you're talking about, around the issue of environmental ethics and animal philosophy and so on, none of which seem to be recognized within the continental tradition. Although, of course, I mean, I'm not denying that Spinoza, Kant, Hegel, you know, have all had their things to say about human-animal relations, obviously, but not in the way that was then asking us to reconsider them from the kind of perspective of new ecological, environmental ideas. And so, yeah, the Anglo-Americans are the ones that are sort of leading the field. And, you know, and very little seemed to have seeped through to the continental thinking, which was, you know, again, in contrast to the way in which we, at that point, were supposed to be always taking note of everything coming across from, you know, from the continent. I'm talking here from a slightly Anglo-centric point of view, as you can see. So I was, you know, I just wanted to, in a way, correct the record on this one a bit and point out that Derrida wasn't actually saying anything terribly new. There is now a collection edited by Calaco. Do you know the collection of continental thinking on philosophy? It's called Animal Philosophy. But it came late in the day, and I don't know why. Do you have any ideas yourself? Does anyone else? I mean, the English are supposed to like animals, but I can't think that. I don't think that can be the reason, really. Has it got something to do with the Enlightenment and its impact? Yeah.
Thank you for, and I'm over here to your right.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
No worries. Thank you for an interesting and provocative talk here. My question extends Tina and Alan's question, and it pivots on the question of hypocrisy. I often have or I have a lot of ethical convictions about how to treat non-human species, for instance, but I often fail to live my life in accordance with these ethical convictions. For me, new materialists and posthumanists are trying to bridge that gap by changing my affective and perceptual dispositions so that I feel like I eat a relative when I'm eating a steak, for instance.
So that you feel, sorry?
Feel that I feel like I'm eating a relative when I'm eating a steak. That's sort of, I guess, the purpose of changing my sense of how I relate to non-human species for the new materialist and post-humanist. And what I'm missing in Marxist critiques of new materialism is an alternative to that sort of alternative to the new materialist attempt to bridge the gap between ethical convictions and actually carrying those convictions out. So I'm asking basically, what is the alternative here? And maybe I'm also asking whether or not you're sort of overemphasizing the force of the inherent force of ethical convictions in a way.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things that you raised there, I think, is the extent of what you call hypocrisy in a way, the way in which, I'm guilty too, actually. I mean, I'm in all sorts of ways. You know, I'm an occasional meat eater, but in fact, but also can't kill a fly, you know. That doesn't make sense to me. At least I find it extremely difficult to kill anything myself, but will occasionally. I don't imagine that I'm that different from quite a lot of other people at this sort of level. So, but I suppose the question of then raising is the way to go about it to try to imaginatively shift the position of the animal in a way that is actually, I think I was arguing, in a way not appropriate to think of it as your relative, actually. Because it isn't the same as a human, at least not a human relative. So maybe, in a way, trying to do it that way around is forcing something that is ethically confused, to say the least. The next bit of your question, I guess, is, well, what instead might we do as a way of shifting our... Is it our thinking or our behaviours, or both, I suppose? Why do you... are you saying you want to shift your thinking in order to be better able to change your behaviour, do you think? Is that what you're saying? And we need to find a way of rethinking that then makes it... I mean, a bit like, say... I mean, what you're suggesting is that if we think of it as cannibalism, perhaps. What?
I think I'm just saying that the new materialists are trying to provide an answer that will help us not being hypocrites.
Yes.
What would your answer be to that?
I don't think I've worked out that answer fully at the moment, I'm afraid. Again, it's a bit like the first question we had. I think acknowledging some of these issues is probably as far as we're going to get at the moment. But I think we do need to acknowledge them. I think it is foolish not to. I mean, I'm glad you brought that issue up, because I think a lot of us are living sort of in a doubled-up sort of way around these kind of questions in relation to our treatment of other creatures. So, but being aware of it and wanting to, in some sense, move out of that condition is probably quite important as well. Yeah, I can't answer any better at the moment, I don't think. If anybody else can, come in. But we probably need to fill. Thank you.